Hey everybody, this is John for mtgotavern coming at you with another freeform video. This one, we kind of spin off of the video I did about the mulligan of Modern Burn, was what are the 5 easiest decks to arguably play. Once again, if you do like modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, especially with the red-based variety. We also do opinion pieces like this and give you opinions of what might be the easiest decks to play in the modern format, as well as many other things related to the modern format on the channel. If you like the kind of content, please consider subscribing, and I will see you with the list here in 1 second. So starting out with an honorable mention here, as we're kind of cheating a little bit instead of going with the top 5, we have kind of one of the newer additions to the thing, and this is kind of indicative of a few different deck archetypes that exist in the format that they're relatively easy to play, but they have some complications attached to them. This one being Reanimator. This is a very high variance deck. It's generally an A plus B deck, but does have some play to it in terms of what it's capable of outside of just the hard reanimation plan, which your main goal with this deck is to get an Archon of Cruelty into the graveyard, bring it back with Persist, or in Burial Rites, or any of those kind of things. There's many different variations of this deck, but it's basically an A plus B combo deck that has an okay fairish game plan. Using things like Solitude and Grief to disrupt your opponent, Muldrift to draw some cards, Teferi Time Raveler to kind of protect the combo, Faithful Mending and Unmarked Grave to get things in the graveyard, Prismatic Ending has a little bit of interaction. So, overall, fairly easy deck to pilot, but does have some skill in terms of what you're doing, especially in the post-board game. Playing through Graveyard Hate, which your sideboard's generally designed to help counter, but, you know, it's a simplistic deck in theory, but the learning to play around particular hate pieces and stuff can be difficult, and, you know, learning to mulligan aggressively. So it's got not many decisions in terms of what it does throughout the game. And the thing is, the combo that you're trying to assemble, the A plus B reanimation package, while it often puts you tremendously far ahead, doesn't necessarily win you the game outright in certain kind of matches. So for that reason, this is an honorable mention, but a deck, you know, it's newer to the format, so maybe over time it will prove to be a simpler deck as people refine and build the correct version of this deck over time. But Esper Reanimator, honorable mention. Very powerful, fairly simplistic deck, but does have some complicated lines and learning to play around hate cards, especially in the post-board games. So number 5 on our list is Cascade decks, but specifically the Rhinos variant of the deck. While this is a somewhat complicated deck compared to some of the rest of the decks on our list, it does have a very much one-card combo in this deck, and that is the various Cascade mechanics into the card of Crashing Footfalls. Oftentimes this allows you to get to 3 mana, and put 8 power worth of monsters into play, and then you just kind of play a tempo game from there, just kind of riding out your threats to kill your opponent. You have ways to play around counter spells and stuff, so this is a deck that on the surface is fairly easy to understand the game plan. It does have some nuance to, you know, the tempo and control aspects of the deck against certain things, and then playing through various hate pieces in the sideboard, things like Chalice of the Void, Void Mirror, and some other things that can interact with it, counter spells, etc. What makes this deck easy, obviously, is you kind of have the I win button. You have the turn 3, 8 power, or Shardless Agent 10 power, and then you just kind of kill your opponent over a turn or two by, you know, using your Force of Negations and your various forms of interaction to either protect your creatures or clear the way and just kill your opponent. So, fairly simplistic game plan. Generally, you're going to be mulliganing towards a Cascade spell, especially in this version that's playing 12 Cascaders. Alternatively, you can play a decent fair game, so, you know, a lot of your opening things are scripted by looking for their Cascade things, getting your 3rd land drop, and kind of trying to ride your 2 4/4s to win, or casting multiple Cascade spells, trying to win from there. There is some complications in the sideboard games, as there are hate cards for this. Also, counter spells and such can be difficult to navigate, as well as discard spells. There's a lot of redundancy in this deck, but not a lot of selection. So it can run out of fuel quickly if your opponent can disrupt you. So it's an easy deck to learn, pick up, and understand. A little bit complicated to master, a little bit complicated to play around the hate pieces. For that reason, it's only number 5 on our list, and not the easiest deck potentially to play in the modern. Number 4, and the reason that we even came up with this list, is a deck that I finish or feature prominently on this channel, and that is the Burn variants. Now this primarily refers to the Burn variant, not the Prowess variants, as the creature-based versions of the deck, or heavier-based creature-based versions of the deck, are a little bit more complicated. And much like with the Cascade decks, the Living End version and the Glimpse of Tomorrow version are a little bit more difficult to understand and to pilot correctly. I do think this is the prototypical aggro deck in the format, and probably the easiest one to understand and pick up and play. So while I would say Burn is a relatively simplistic deck, You're trying to get your opponent to 20 as quickly as possible. You have hasty creatures, you have Eidolon the Great Rebel, you have a bunch of spells that can go to your opponent's face. Fairly simplistic to pick up. Has a very high floor in terms of its capabilities for such a relatively low skill deck. There's a lot of nuance to the deck, learning to play around life gain spells, learning when your burn spells are supposed to clear your opponent's creatures out, when they're supposed to go face. There are a lot of complicated things to learn. Mulliganing can be tricky with the deck, as this is a very resource-heavy deck, so mulligans can be very punishing to this deck. So there are some skills that are necessary with this deck. However, there's very few decisions with the deck. However, a lot of them are often very important. Your sequencing of your creatures, the sequencing of your spells, maximizing your mana efficiency, etc. are all important skills for the burn deck. But that said, a lot of people would say it's a fairly easy deck to play. So I would say it has a low skill floor, but a high skill ceiling, maybe not as high as other decks, but does give you some room for play. So for that reason, it's number 4 on our list, as there are other easy decks to play in the modern format. So deck number 3 on our list is Monotron, a deck that has reputation for being a relatively brain-dead deck, because 1 + 1 + 1 is 7. What? You don't know what that means? Okay, so the thing with this deck is you're mainly built around the concept of trying to get Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower into play. Each one of these on their own taps for a single colorless mana. Whenever you get all 3 into play, your mines and your power plants tap for 2 colorless mana, your tower taps for 3 colorless mana. So if you get all 3 of those lands into play, you suddenly can cast 7 mana worth of spells on turn 3. In order to facilitate this, you have things like Sylvan Scrying, Ancient Stirrings, and Expedition Map to allow you to find and assemble your Tron pieces. The primary skill that you're going to be tested with your Tron deck is your ability to mulligan to as consistently get Tron as quickly as possible, especially with the London mulligan roll. Mulliganing to 4-3 is definitely possible to win with this deck. As its payoffs are quite powerful, there's not a lot of decks in the format that if you drop the right bomb on turn 3 are going to be able to beat you. However, the downside of Tron is if your bombs don't line up against what your opponent's doing, or they can answer either your Tron land or your bomb or 2, the modern format has sped up enough to the point where if your first bomb isn't relevant, then you could be dead on turn 3 or 4. Powerful deck, fairly linear. Most of the skill set comes down to learning to mulligan, and then there are some decisions with Karn the Great Creator specifically, with a little bit of a wish sideboard for artifact hate pieces. So there is some skill in terms of the gameplay, but most of the skill is in the mulliganing of the deck and how to maximize your particular payoff that you happen to run. Now granted, they play a lot of awesome payoffs. They play Karn the Great Creator, they play Ugin the Spirit Dragon, they play a bunch of the Eldrazi's, they play Wormcoil Engines, but sometimes your payoffs just don't line up against what your opponent's doing. So fairly easy to deck to learn, a little bit limited in what it can do. Does have some skill play in what it does, but it's more about its positioning in the format and learning to mulligan than it is the skill play with the deck. Deck number 2, that is the most easiest to play in the modern format, is Boggles, or Hexproof as some people call it. It's so named after Boggles, after the card specifically Slippery Boggle over here, which is a 1/1 Hexproof creature, which means your opponent can't interact with it basically. Glade Cover Scout, also a Hexproof creature, and then it tends to run different other types of creatures. This one, Core Spirit Dancer, which is very powerful with the engine of the deck, which is basically you play a bunch of enchantments, you suit it up on one of your hexproof creatures, you get a very large, difficult to interact with, if not impossible, creature, and you beat your opponent to death with it. You do have some life gain effects, so you can race aggro decks. This is often a turn 4 deck. The main skill with this deck is mulliganing to your Boggle or Glades Covered Scout. Not a lot of skill in that, honestly. It can be a very linear deck to play. One of the things is I asked questions about this on Reddit and Facebook. One person referred to it as the training wheels of Modern, and I would be hard-pressed to disagree that this deck is a very low-effort deck to learn to get into the format. Not a lot of play with the deck. Now you do have some stuff in the sideboards against various decks, that can make matchups a little bit better, but the reality is this deck either makes or breaks itself by its mulligans. If it cannot find a boggle in the 8/1 mana Boggles, tends to struggle a lot. So play skill in this deck isn't very high. The mulligan decisions on this deck aren't particularly interesting. It is kind of a high roll deck in some regards, but hasn't been particularly well positioned in quite some time. Still a deck some people play, does have some good matchups like Burn and some other matchups, but generally fairly low skill deck, pretty easy to learn. That's why it's number 2 on this list, and you're going, What could possibly be easier to play with this? I will get to that 1 second. Now this deck that is number 1 is green red scape shift specific. Not the bring to light variants, they're a little bit more controlling, have a little bit more controlling elements, and they're more of a ramp control hybrid. This is specifically a ramp deck trying to get to a payoff and trying to kill your opponent by getting to 7 lands, either casting scape shift or a primeval type. What this deck is trying to do is centered around the card Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. Basically says, for every mountain you have in play, if you have 6 or more mountains, every time a mountain comes into play, you can deal 3 damage to a target. A lot of times in Modern, fetch shock mana bases, quite a few decks lower their total below 18 on its own. So, what theoretically can happen is you can get 7 lands into play Escape Shift, win the game. Alternatively, you can cast a Primeval Titan, get some Valakuts, set up for a kill on the next turn. So the key to this deck is 6 or 7 lands, depending on which your payoffs you're looking. This deck also plays Dryad of the Elysian Groves, which makes every land you have in play every basic land type, which reduces the number of lands you need to 6. So there's a little bit of complicated lines, but basically this deck is trying to count to 6 lands if you have Dryad in play, 7 lands otherwise, cast Escape Shift, get some mountains, kill your opponent. Sometimes you have to control their board and stuff. It's basically a 1-card combo. One of the new recent more innovations of the deck that popped up, as this deck has not been played much in some time, is Wish. Wish is a card that allows you to go get a card out of your sideboard. Makes things a little bit more complicated. Generally, you're going to try to get to 7 mana, cast Escape Shift in the same turn. Not particularly interesting. A lot of people say this is the most linear deck in the format, even over Boggles. You could say Boggles is easier, you could say this one is easier, I can see it either way. But having played both decks, I would say that this deck's a little bit more easy to understand than even Boggles. Because Boggles, sometimes you gotta talk Planeswalkers, you gotta play around Sweepers. This deck, there's not a ton of things that interact specifically with Valakut in Game 1. So, a little less things that can interact with it. It's more a matter of, is your combo fast enough to kill your opponent? Today's Modern, that's very debatable. But this is my pick for the number 1 easiest to play deck in the Modern format. What's yours? Let me know in the comments down below. This has been John for MTG Nexus. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hope to see you for the next video.